going to continue our little series here. As it was just noted a moment ago, we have 3 parts to this very quick weekend together, and the 3 sessions are designed to hit the 3 major categories of Bible critiques, if you will. And this is really helpful for you in your Christian life, I hope, because you know, when you hear a critique, it's hard to know how to handle all the barrage of stuff coming your way. And if you can categorize it, you can have some sense of what kind of objection you're dealing with. It can help you answer it, right? Because I don't know about you, but there's so many objections to the Bible out there that you get sort of overwhelmed by them. And you begin to think, well, who could ever answer them all? And maybe I shouldn't even try. Well, the goal this weekend is at least to give you the 3 major categories for the kinds of questions coming your way, so you can at least sort of slot them in the right place and have at least some general answer to the kinds of things people are asking. And you'll recall that there's really 3 different sort of ways people attack the Bible. The first one we dealt with last night was sort of this issue of the origins of the Bible, where it came from, who wrote it, why these books and not others, that kind of question. That comes up a good bit. Then the second session last night was on transmission, right? So do we actually have the Bible? Particularly, do we have the words of the Bible? Have they been reliably copied over time? That's what we dealt with in our second session last night. And now we come in this third one to the issue of the Bible's content. So I trust you have an outline. I saw them being handed out. At the top it should say number 3 there. It's our third topic today. And now we're going to be dealing with the issue of the Bible's content. This is the kind of objection we'll be dealing with here in this third session. If you think about it for a moment, the first 2 sessions really had very little to do with what the Bible teaches. If you notice that, the very first category of objections in terms of the Bible's origins doesn't really matter what the Bible teaches, it's just where it came from. And then the second kind of objection is the transmission issue, which again is whether it was copied well, but it has nothing to do with what it teaches. But now we come to the third category of objection. That is, what does the Bible actually say? And people ask me all the time, which of the 3 categories is the biggest? And that's a hard thing to know. But I would say this is a pretty big one. Lots of people's objections has to do with things they read in the Bible they don't like. Or things they read in the Bible they find problematic. Or things they read they find upsetting. Or things that don't fit together. Or things that contradict themselves. Or things that seem historically implausible. So leaving aside transmission and leaving aside origin, some people never even think about those things. Maybe your neighbor you talk to never even thought about where the canon comes from and never heard of Bar Ehrman, doesn't think about textual transmission. But he does read the Bible occasionally, and when he does, he finds it to be just silly and ridiculous and doesn't make any sense to him. And so he objects to the content of it. So this category that we're going to talk about this morning is a big one. It's sort of a catch-all sort of category. Now, in its own right, you could spend a whole weekend on this category, right? I could spend a whole weekend on one part of this category. But we're going to try to deal with it in sort of 3 parts here. I'm going to draw out the 3 major kinds of content objections that people make to the Bible. And as I go through these 3, you will have heard these. In fact, you'll recognize these immediately as, oh, I've heard that, and of course I've heard that, and these are standard, fair type things that come up when it comes to our conversations about the Bible. So take a look at your outline with me for a moment. I've divided this into different kinds of content attacks. One is historical. We'll talk about that first. Then philosophical. And then, believe it or not, moral. And when I say believe it or not, you may not take much to believe that. But we'll talk about that too. That's sort of the new fad today. When I say today, I mean the last 20 years, is to attack the Bible on moral grounds, which historically was an oddity. You never really do that. You may attack it on historical grounds, but certainly not moral ones. But now, our culture is pretty upset with the Bible morally, too. Okay, let's start with the first one here, historical attacks. And that is this challenge about the Bible contradicting itself. This is the number 1 claim about the content of the Bible that people are bothered by. Is it doesn't fit together. It disagrees with itself. This is particularly a poignant issue in the Gospels, right? I've been talking about the Gospels throughout the weekend a little bit. The Gospels, of course, give you more opportunity for these sorts of conversations because you've got 4 Gospels where you can compare them to one another. People always say, oh, this part doesn't fit with that part, and on you go. And so the issue of Bible contradictions is going to be paramount. And in this little section, I'm just going to give you some broad thoughts and tips and so forth about this. But I want to begin with one critical observation, and that is this issue really does matter. Notice what I say here. Why is this important? I think you know why it's important. Because our belief is that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. And if it's God's words and not human words, then obviously God doesn't lie. God doesn't say one thing one time and then contradict himself another time. God doesn't sort of double speak, if you will. And so the problem of contradictions, if there's a real one, is a legitimate concern. We want to preserve the integrity and authority of the Bible. So it's certainly critical, but I think this particular issue is just grandly misunderstood by most people who tackle it. So what do we do to handle these things? Let's just walk through some of the things that I mentioned here about contradictions. This always happens to me in a variety of places. I get in a lot of conversations on airplanes. I'm on a lot of airplanes. And you know how it is on a plane. If you fly much, you sit down on a plane, and what's the first question someone always asks when you sit down? They always ask, well, what do you do? Right? And then whenever I do that, I'm like, here we go, right? Because as soon as I tell them what I do, you know, I'm a professor of New Testament at a seminary. You feel that awkward pause in the conversation, and then usually they say something like, well, you know, I go to church, and they start sort of explaining themselves. And I tell people, you don't have to explain anything to me, I'm just sitting on an airplane, right? But it's not long till you get into the Bible. And then it's not long after that that you hear people's objections. And then it's not long after that that people make this claim, that the Bible contradicts itself. And before I even get into the list of sort of tips on how to deal with this, I'll tell you one of the things I typically do in conversations like this that I didn't write down, but I'll tell you here because I think it's helpful. When I get in a conversation with someone about Bible contradictions, this is usually what I'll ask them. I'll say, look, tell me that one contradiction that you've studied and just can't solve, and maybe I can help you solve it. Now, that's a very simple question, right? It's a very innocuous question, but it's also a very intentional question. Because when I ask that question, 90% of the time I ask it, the answer is always the same, which is, well, I don't have a particular contradiction in mind. In other words, I ask them, tell me that one contradiction you studied that you just can't crack. Maybe I can help you crack it. Maybe I can give you a perspective on it. And the answer is, I don't have one. I don't have a particular contradiction. I just heard somewhere. I just read online. My aunt or uncle told me that the Bible contradicts itself. And therefore it must. And you realize that people believe something without any basis at all in terms of why they believe it. And you think, well, how could a person take the Bible and all its claims and within 30 seconds, under the umbrella of it contradicts itself, just sweep it off the table and say, well, that's done. I've solved that problem in life. I know the Bible can't be trusted because it contradicts itself. Let's move on to the next thing. And you're thinking, how could someone do that with that amount of confidence when you've looked at it for such a little amount of time that you can't even name a single contradiction that bothers you, that made you reject the Bible? Why would people do that? And you realize with that question, it opens up something very quickly for the non-Christian you're talking to. How seriously have you taken this? Okay. Are you just looking for a quick reason to dismiss the Bible? And the idea out there at 30,000 feet, this big broad idea that the Bible contradicts itself, is all I needed to push that aside and get on with my life. And truthfully, that's what most people want to do, right? Most people are looking for a reason to kick the Bible to the curb, right? If you can give it to them, well, by golly, they're going to take it. They don't need to know anything about the reason. So one of the things right out of the gate here with supposed Bible contradictions is just ask which one has stumped your friend. And you'll find out that most people can't name a single one. Now, of course, some can. Some are sophisticated Bible readers. Some might have taken a university class and learned all the supposed Bible contradictions, and they can rattle them off to you. And every once in a while, they'll come across someone like this. So what do you do then? Okay, look down at your notes. Let me just make a few quick observations about this question as we think about it. First thing, trust there's an answer. One of the things that people get hung up on is that they personally don't have an answer to an apparent Bible contradiction. Maybe you've come across one. Maybe you found it yourself. Maybe a friend pointed it out to you and you're like, I don't know how to answer that. By the way, if you get in a situation like that, that is not at all unusual. People think, for whatever sets of reasons, people often think, if I don't have the answer, then there's not an answer. But why would you think that, right? Why would you think that if you personally don't have an answer, that there's not an answer? What I want to encourage you to think about today when you think about Bible contradictions is that you're not obligated to answer all of them. Okay? No one person could ever sort of study enough to be able to go through every one and have some PhD level answer for all of them. You're not obligated to do that. But you can believe that there is an answer, even if you don't happen to have it. Moreover, don't think for a moment that the idea of a Bible contradiction is some new thing that Christians had never thought of before. I'm always amazed when I have these airplane conversations that people will throw out things. And it's almost like I want to say, oh wow, you know, we've never read the Bible before and never noticed that particular observation. And people mention it as if it's this brand new thing that no one has ever studied before. And what you realize in church history is that these supposed contradictions have been looked at and examined all the way from the very beginning of Christianity. My book that I mentioned last night, if you were here, my latest book called Christianity at the Crossroads, I explore Christianity in the 2nd century there. And one of the interesting figures is this pagan critic of Christianity called Celsus, who's a Roman sort of intellectual who likes to pound on Christianity for all the things he doesn't like about it. But guess what one of his claims is? The Gospels contradict each other. Wow, never heard that before, right? And so you realize all the way back to the 2nd century that claim is there, and Christians have been answering the claim. So make sure you realize that this isn't new, it's not unexpected, people have examined these things, you may not have an answer, but that doesn't mean there's not an answer. Second thing to note here about apparent contradictions is they're often caused by a misunderstanding of ancient historiography. Okay? A misunderstanding of the way history is done in the ancient world. You know, when you and I write history today, or think about people writing history today, we have a certain standard of the way it ought to be done. In the modern day, by golly, if you quote somebody, you quote them verbatim. You get their exact words. If you tell a story in the modern day, by golly, you're going to tell it in chronological order, tight and neat. If you tell a story in the modern day, you're going to include all the details I think you should include and leave nothing out, and on it goes. But in the ancient world, history wasn't done that way. And we've got to be careful not to apply modern standards of historiography to an ancient text and have it live up to what we want to do now and act like if it doesn't live up to our modern standards of historiography, somehow it's deficient. That's not true with the Bible, certainly not true with the Gospels. Let me mention a few examples of this. You can see them in your notes there. First of all, paraphrase quotations. People don't realize that in the ancient world, it would be often you would not always quote someone verbatim. You would often summarize what they say. You would summarize it and rewrite it in your own words to capture for your audience and for your situation the sort of essence of what their teachings are. They would do this lots of reasons in the ancient world to save space. And if you heard a whole speech by somebody in the ancient world, you wouldn't necessarily write down every single word of the speech. You may sort of write down a summary statement or a quote of this sort of thing, and that was typical in the ancient world. So people look at the sayings of Jesus, for example, and think, well, one of his sayings over here is a little different than the saying over there, and you realize, hold on a second, paraphrase quotations are commonplace in the ancient world. You can have, by the way, true paraphrases and false paraphrases, right? Or accurate paraphrases and non-accurate paraphrases. But we do this today. You hear a news report about something happening in politics or in the world, they say, today Senator so-and-so said this. And rarely is the said this a quote. Usually it's a summary. Said that he wanted to cut taxes, or said he wanted to do this or do that. Okay, fine, but rarely are those quotes. Often they're summaries. This is true also in the Bible. A second thing, non-chronological narratives. The Bible doesn't always put things, the Gospels in particular, don't always put things in chronological order. We know this for a lot of reasons. Historically, sometimes you would take a group of stories and you'd lump them together for thematic reasons. They would all have the same general theme. Then you'd have another group of stories with the same general theme. This is done in the Gospels. We see this particularly in the Gospel of Mark. Mark likes to take all these sort of what we would call controversy stories of Jesus, where he's arguing with people, and he sweeps them all together in one section. Whereas the other Gospels may follow it more chronologically. They're not always obligated to tell the story in chronological order like we would like. They can rearrange them for thematic reasons. There's also selective reports. This is an incredibly important thing to realize about apparent contradictions, is that is no one author can say everything. So often authors leave out parts of stories. But just because one author mentions something and another author leaves it out does not mean that's a contradiction. Because lots of times when you tell a story, you hone in on the part you want to tell. It's a selective telling of the story. This is something, again, that we do in the modern day. You tell the parts that are absolutely the highlights. And this is something that people think, well, is there one angel at the tomb, or is there two angels at the tomb? One gospel writer only mentions one, another gospel writer mentions both of them. Is that a contradiction? Well, not if you understand this particular fact, is that some authors only want to hone in on one particular aspect of the story. Maybe the angel that was talking, so it only bothers to mention one, even though there would have been two there. This is, by the way, the normal way history's done. Okay? Even in our modern day, when you do history, you can't say everything. And so selective reports are key for this. There's also things like round numbers. People get caught up with the specificity and precision of things. Sometimes numbers in the Bible are rounded or generalized, and we do this too. I was talking to my son the other day about, he had read something in the Gospels, and he'd asked me about the way they fit together, and we were talking about sort of trying to make the Bible more precise than it's intending to be in certain instances, and he's like, I don't understand what you mean. And so I asked him, I said, well, how old are you? He's like, what? You know how old I am. I was like, yeah, but just tell me, how old are you? He goes, well, I'm 13. I was like, would you stop lying? He's like, what? What are you talking about? I was like, you just lied to me. He's like, well, no, I didn't. I'm 13. I'm like, no, you're not. You're 13 in 8 months and 11 days and 6 hours. So you lied to me. He's like, no, I didn't lie to you. You didn't want all that information, right? You just wanted 13 or 14. You didn't need all the little divisions up, right? I'm like, well, I don't know. Did I? And I made a point to him in that conversation that lots of times we speak imprecisely on purpose in order to accommodate whatever situation we're in. Now, these are just samples, if you will, of the kind of things to look for in the Bible and realize that modern historiography and ancient historiography are not always the same thing. A couple other things to note here. Certainly you want to engage in a careful and detailed study of the text. I'm amazed at how many supposed contradictions are alleviated just by looking at it a little more closely, right? If you want to find a contradiction, you can find one and convince yourself it's there. And I'm also convinced that if you want to solve it, it can be solved if you study the text and carefully look at the details. This is particularly true in the resurrection accounts of the Gospels. The resurrection accounts of the Gospels are the kind of accounts that people have often sort of piled on and said, wow, these can't fit together, these can't match, there's too many contradictions. Okay, I hear those objections, but when you actually sit down and lay it all out and study it and talk about all the options and all the implications of everything, you realize actually they can fit together, and they do fit together. And so a careful study of the text is paramount. And then the last thing here, you need to make sure that you can seek out help from available resources when you come across a challenging passage. There's so many good places to turn to help you work through a difficult part of your Bibles. Certainly if you have a good commentary, that can help. If you find some reliable and good websites out there, that can help. And I would encourage you to talk to your own pastors and elders. God is giving you people in your life at this very church to provide oversight and help. When you have a Bible question around these sorts of things, don't miss the obvious, right? Which is the very people God has put over you at this congregation. And so there's all kinds of different resources there that you can appeal to. I mentioned last night, for those who are at the conference, about my website. For some of you weren't there, so I'll mention it now. My website deals with a lot of Bible reliability questions. I have actually a whole series on apparent contradictions on there, where I even have guest scholars come in and write their sort of solutions to some of the main challenges out there in the Bible. The name of my website is called Cannon Fodder, one N in canon, because it's referring to the biblical canon, not the light the fuse, blow the cannonball out canon, if you don't know the difference between those two words. But the URL is just my name, michaeljkruger.com. And so I've got a number of things over there as far as resources. And there's other many good websites online, of course, that you can explore these sorts of things if you track them down. Okay, so the first here is historical attacks, and I know this is a very brief overview, but that was a way to sort of at least broadly address this issue of Bible contradictions. Let's look at a second kind of attack that comes our way in terms of the content of the Bible, and that is what we might call a philosophical attack. The first one's more historical, right? Do our sources fit together, or do they agree? This one is more philosophical, and these can look a lot of different ways. Someone can look at the Bible and they can read it and they say, I just don't find that believable. I don't find that something that I can assent to. I can't accept that happened. Now, when someone makes an objection like that, notice it's not an historical claim. It's not that, oh, all this historical evidence shows it didn't happen. That's not it. That was the first point. This is more philosophical. They're approaching the Bible and they're saying, from my perspective, from my worldview, things like that don't happen. You know, the sun doesn't stop in the sky. Sorry. That doesn't take place. Axe heads don't float. Okay? When people die, they stay dead. And yet this book is filled with all these things that we would call miracles, for example, that I find just impossible. They're these supernatural things. And so lots of people object to the Bible on philosophical grounds. Now when you think about that for a moment, what you realize is that when people object to the Bible, oftentimes they're not objecting to the Bible on the basis of historical evidence. They're basing their objections to the Bible on their own worldview. Okay? This is a really important thing to grasp, because it's actually going to come up a little bit in the sermon today that we'll be looking at in just a short amount of time. But when people show up to look at the Bible, and of course you know this, but it needs to be, we all need to be reminded of it. People don't show up and look at the Bible, you know, with this sort of blank slate. Like, well, let's just be open to whatever it has to say. I'm going to come to it with my white lab coat on, and I'm going to be neutral, and I'm going to examine the Bible. I'm going to see if it makes sense or not. No, that's not the way people approach the Bible. People approach the Bible with a hardened in stone worldview, a set of beliefs and assumptions about reality, about what is possible and impossible, about what's likely or not likely. And then they read the Bible, and whether it fits with their worldview or not determines about whether they accept it. So notice in that situation, people's acceptance or rejection of the Bible has less to do with the Bible and actually has more to do with them. Okay? Has more to do with their own worldview and their own assumptions that they bring to the table. And in such situations, one of the things you find out very quickly is that people are very willing to critique the Bible, but they're very unwilling to critique their own worldview. Or to put it another way, people are very sort of quick to think about what might be wrong with the Bible, but they're not very quick to reflect upon what might be wrong with their worldview. Their worldview in their mind is absolutely the way it is. And then they just look at the Bible and say, well, it doesn't fit my worldview, therefore I'm kicking it out. And they don't realize how arbitrary that seems. Why would we kick the Bible out just because it doesn't fit with your worldview? You've got to be better than that. You've got to actually show your worldview is the right worldview before you can just reject the Bible on the basis of it. Right? But people don't think that way. They think, well, it doesn't fit with what I happen to prefer about the world, therefore it can't be true. That's not a good argument. And in this particular Roman numeral, we want to sort of say a few words about it. Now, there's lots of different philosophical attacks on the Bible. Let me just focus in on this issue of miracles. People, as I've already indicated, look at the Bible and think, you know, that's too much for me to believe. I just don't think those things happen. And therefore, when I read a book about these things happening, I must reject it. Okay, fair enough. But what you realize there is that that rejection of the Bible is based on an earlier premise. Okay? And that earlier premise that a person has is that miracles are impossible. Okay? So given that miracles are impossible, when I read the Bible and I read the story about the Red Sea parting or whatever it happens to be, then I can reasonably reject it because I know in my worldview that miracles are impossible. Okay, that would work just fine, right, as a way of reasoning, if in fact you knew that miracles were impossible. But what I want to challenge here, and what we want to challenge when we're talking to our non-Christian friend, is that I want to take that little piece of your worldview where you say miracles are impossible. I want to ask how you know that. How do you demonstrate that? On what basis do you think you're sure about that? What you realize here is that most people just have a certain sort of tenet in their worldview that they assume is valid, and they never have paused to reflect on whether it can be defended. And the issue of miracles is a good example of this. People have an anti-supernatural assumption in their worldview, and they've never reflected on how they know that miracles are impossible in the first place. Let me just talk about a few aspects of this. One of the things that people will say is, well, I know miracles maybe aren't impossible, but they're very unlikely. Okay, maybe someone will say something like this. Miracles are very improbable. Okay, depends on what one means by that. Improbability itself is predicated upon a whole worldview about what things are most likely to happen as opposed to other things. But if you think about it, miracles are not at all unlikely or improbable if God actually exists. Or to put it another way, miracles are not at all improbable or unlikely if the Christian God exists. If the Christian God exists, then He not only made the world, but controls the world and often intervenes in the world and does things in the world. And if you think, well, I can't believe that something like that could happen, but if God exists, and God can do anything, and God controls all nature, and God can do miracles, then why would it be unlikely or improbable that these stories are true? In other words, to say that these miracles are unlikely or improbable already presupposes that the Christian God doesn't exist. But that's something itself that has to be shown, right? So now our non-Christian friend has got a double problem. Not only do you have to argue that miracles are impossible or unlikely, but now to show that, he has to actually show that God doesn't exist. Or at least the Christian God doesn't exist. Because if the Christian God does exist, miracles aren't at all improbable. How are you going to show that? Very hard to show or prove a universal negative like the non-existence of the Christian God. Now your friend would actually have to almost prove atheism in order to prove miracles are impossible. That's a very tall philosophical order. Here's the other thing I want you to notice about miracles, though, or at least this particular philosophical objection, and that is they're inherently circular. The objection against miracles is inherently circular. I want you to imagine a conversation with your non-Christian friend about this particular topic. Imagine you're reading in the Bible, and you're reading about the story of Jesus healing a leper. And your non-Christian friend says, no, I'm not buying it. And you're like, well, why not? And he says, well, because that's a miracle. And you're like, well, what's your problems with miracles? He goes, well, I can't accept them. And you're like, well, why can't you accept them? He says, well, because miracles are impossible. And then you say, well, how do you know miracles are impossible? And then he'll say something like, probably because I've never seen one. Okay, and then our response would be, well, what about all the people out there that have claimed to see one? Well, then he would say, well, they're all wrong. How do you know they're all wrong? Answer, because miracles are impossible. And you realize it's utterly circular. He claims miracles are impossible. When asked how he knows that, because I haven't seen one. What about all the people that have seen one? Well, they're all wrong. How do you know they're all wrong? Because miracles are impossible. Now, in addition to the circularity of that argument, which is highly problematic, I also want to point out something else about that argument. And this too will come up in the sermon today. And that is that the remarkable hubris and arrogance of that argument. I'm going to sit here in this room today and tell you that every single person on the planet who's ever claimed to see a miracle, all of them are mistaken. Every single one of them. Not just in the modern day, by the way, but I also know that every single person throughout history who's claimed to have seen a miracle, they're all wrong. I know. Trust me. I can give you the answers to these things. I know they're all wrong. I'm going to make this grand sweeping truth claim that everyone in the world who's ever seen a miracle, all of them are mistaken. Because I know that miracles are impossible. Even though I haven't ever given a reason for how I know this. Now when you hear it that way, you're thinking, wow, that's borderline arrogant, intellectually. Can you imagine just telling everybody in the whole planet is wrong? Now, Christians do this. You might think, well, Christians are arrogant too. But the question isn't whether Christians are telling people they're wrong. The question is, do Christians have a basis for knowing something like that? And we're going to claim a basis, namely the Bible. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what basis does our non-Christian friend for knowing that every particular experience of miracles are all mistaken? Answer nothing other than his own brain. I can't tell you how wearisome it is, and I'm sure you feel this, that Christians are accused of being arrogant and dogmatic. But then when you hear an argument like that, you're thinking, wow, maybe it's not just Christians who should receive that critique. Because anybody who goes out there and says every single person who's ever seen a miracle is mistaken, that's a fairly dogmatic statement. Flip your notes over and look on the back. Look at this quote by C.S. Lewis. You may know Lewis's story. Lewis, of course, was an atheist who became a believer. And he ended up sort of rejecting his own arguments. And this is an example of how he realized his argument against miracles was circular. Look what he says here. Unfortunately, we know the experience against miracles, in other words, this sort of miracles don't happen in the world, to be uniform only if we know that all the reports of them are false. And we can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle. This, of course, is the fundamental problem for the argument against the Bible in its miraculous ways. So here's the upshot of the second point. Your non-Christian friend is going to come to the Bible with a number of what we would call worldview or philosophical objections. Could be miracles, it could be something else. This is just a sample of that. But here's the point. That argument only works if you can first show your worldview is right. But that's something your non-Christian friend still has to do. You can't just say, well, I know my worldview is right, therefore, since I know miracles don't happen, therefore the Bible can't be true. No, you got to back it up one and ask whether you know that miracles don't happen. So this tells us a little tip in our conversations with our non-Christian friends. Our conversation with our non-Christian friends can't just simply be about the Bible. Okay? It has to also be about their worldview and the assumptions that they're bringing to the table. We need to turn the tables on our non-Christian friend and not only be on the defensive, okay, and go on the offense. When I say go on the offense, we need to remind our non-Christian friend that he has to also account for things. He has to also account for what he knows and doesn't know, and how he's certain versus being uncertain, and how he knows about the things in the world being the way he thinks they are. How does he know any of those things? We need to press him on that. And here's what you'll find when you talk to your non-Christian friend about those things. No one's ever pressed him on that. He's never had to give an account for his own worldview. He thinks it's Christianity that's on the defendant's chair. And it's Christianity that's going to be cross-examined. But it's actually his worldview that also has to sit in the defendant's chair and be cross-examined. And you'll find out most people aren't prepared for that kind of situation. All right, let's move on to the last of these content objections, and that is Roman numeral 3 here, moral attacks. As I said from the beginning of our session here, it's remarkable to watch how different kinds of attacks on the Bible have had different levels of popularity throughout the last few generations and really even the history of the church. 50 years ago, if you're going to attack the Bible, you would probably use historical objections. 50 years ago, if you were to attack the Bible, you'd probably use philosophical objections. But there's one thing you probably wouldn't have used 50 years ago. And that is you probably wouldn't have made moral objections to the Bible. In fact, if you were trying to get rid of the Bible 50 years ago, it wasn't really for moral reasons, except for maybe you wanted to not be shackled in by the Bible and you wanted to live in a way that would be immoral. Well, people were sort of aware enough that if you're going to attack the Bible on moral grounds, that's a pretty courageous thing to do. But things have changed in our modern day, as you know. In fact, in our modern day, this third type of content attack may just be the most dominant. Your non-Christian friend may not really read the Bible and go, oh, I don't find it historically reliable. You probably didn't think about such things. Your non-Christian friend may not even think about his own philosophical system. But by golly, when he reads the Bible, he's certainly upset by it. He's upset by a lot of things. Looks at the Bible and says, there's this thing called the doctrine of hell in the Bible. You believe in a God that would send someone to hell forever? I find that morally reprehensible. What kind of God is that? What kind of awful being is that? Why would you believe in a God like that? My God, ever heard anyone talk like that? My God would never do that. Or they look at the Bible and say, wow, God sent a global flood and wiped out every single person on the planet. Really? Everybody? Except for the 8 souls on the ark? What kind of story is that? What kind of diabolical God do you believe in? How morally reprehensible that is. Now, the person who makes that objection does recall that the flood account is a story of God's judgment, probably something that we, in our modern day, need to be reminded of. The flood account in most evangelical churches is turned into this sort of fun Bible kid story. You ever notice that? I recognized this years ago when my oldest daughter was a baby. We got this gift of a quilt, and the quilt was a sort of embroidery of Noah's Ark. And these animals were sticking their heads out of the ark, smiling, and there was the sun shining, and we were like, "Oh, isn't this sweet?" We hung it over her crib, on the wall, and then one day it just dawned on me. So I looked at it, I was like, wow, I just took, literally the world's biggest catastrophic judgment of God and hung it by my child's crib. Going to have issues, going to be seeing a counselor for years from this. I feel overwhelmed by this flood, and there's a sense in which you, completely have forgotten that God wiped out the whole world. And our non-Christian friend comes along and goes, you believe that? And then we remind ourselves, oh, I guess I do. He goes, I find that morally wrong. Of course, it doesn't take much reflection today to realize that part of the objection here is based on what the Bible says about sexuality, marriage, male and female. You know enough about our culture's sort of siren song now to realize that many in our culture look at the Bible and say, wow, so the Bible teaches that marriage is only between a man and a woman. That's offensive. That's morally limiting. That's bigotry, really. That you believe in a book that does that, and on we could go, right? with all people's moral offenses to the Bible. Now, you hear that all the time. What do we do in those situations? Well, one of the fundamental responses we need to recognize here to this is, as I said a moment ago, simply asking the question to our non-Christian friend how he knows the Bible is in fact wrong or morally deficient. What we need to go and do to our non-Christian friend is say, look, let me get this straight. So you're saying the Bible is wrong. If you're saying the Bible is morally deficient, and there's some standard out there that the Bible's not living up to. There's some standard out there, some objective moral norm, some objective standard of ethics that the Bible is violating, that the God of the Bible is not living up to. Would you mind sharing with me what that objective moral standard is and where you got it from? Now, at this particular point, your non-Christian friend has never been asked that question. He thinks it's just a given that these things are bad. He thinks it's just a given that I can just vent and complain about the Bible in all these ways. I don't have to account for moral norms. But in fact, he does have to account for moral norms. If you're going to say the Bible's morally wrong, then you're appealing to some standard in the world, some standard in the universe that's not meeting up to you. Where is this mysterious standard? How do you know it? Where did it come from? And why should I think it's true? Please give me an answer. And the answer is they don't have an answer. In fact, what you'll find quickly happens in situations like this is your non-Christian friend will back off the claim and say, well, I'm not saying there's any moral norms in the universe. I'm not saying there's any moral absolutes. I'm just saying that I personally don't like these things. Okay, he can do that. He can take the sort of step off the argument a little bit and draw it back and say, well, I'm not really saying there's moral absolutes. I'm just saying that personally this is offensive to me. But not liking something is not an argument. Okay? People cannot like the Bible, and many people may not like the Bible, but that's not an argument for its untruth. Okay? If you're going to show the Bible's untrue on the basis of a moral claim, it can't be that I personally don't prefer it. When my kids were younger, I can remember my youngest son just could not stand broccoli. Okay? Man, he just hated it, didn't like it, personally didn't prefer it. And boy, wouldn't he wish that not preferring something could make it go away, right? That me not liking something could change reality, that broccoli could just not exist because he didn't like it. But him not liking it didn't change its existence or its reality. Nor is just simply not liking the Bible an argument that can get it done. In order for this argument to work, and this is the key I want you to get, there actually has to be absolute moral norms the Bible's violating. It can't just be that you don't personally like it, or it doesn't meet your personal preferences. It has to actually be wrong. In order to actually be wrong, you actually have to have some standard by which you know it's wrong. And of course, our non-Christian friend has no standard for this. It can't just be his own opinion. It can't be just human nature. It can't be anything. You have to have some standard by which you could get the moral claim with some sort of footing. And here's what becomes really ironic about this whole discussion about moral norms at this point, is that it's actually Christianity, ironically, that provides the moral foundation for things. It's actually the Bible that provides a moral norm in the world that's absolute and certain, because the God of the Bible provides it. But yet it's that very thing that our non-Christian friend has rejected. So he's rejected the very thing that can provide moral norms, and he's done it on the basis of that thing violating his own moral norms. You can imagine how incredibly frustrating that is in an argument, right? He, in fact, is in one sense using the Bible, because he needs a world that can provide moral norms, to end up rejecting the Bible. It's almost like I want to tell our non-Christian friend that you're borrowing from my worldview, right? You're stealing from my worldview. You need a worldview like mine in order to have moral norms, in order to reject a worldview like mine. You can't do that, right? You're violating the rules of debate. What we need to realize here is that the moral argument, although rhetorically persuasive in our culture, philosophically implodes on itself, unless our non-Christian friend can provide a basis for these things. Now, notice how different that response is to the moral problems, quote unquote, in the Bible than what we typically do. Here's what happens when people bring up moral problems. They say, well, you know, when God told the Israelites to wipe out all the Canaanites in Canaan, that seems like genocide to me. Therefore, I don't believe the Bible. Our response typically to a point like that is to somehow explain that story in a way to make it less offensive. Okay? Well, it didn't really happen like that, and here's what's really going on there, and let me explain that better. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, there's not a time to explain the Bible better, but notice that's usually all we do. What I want to suggest to you is we don't just explain the Bible story better, but we flip the story around and say, oh, you're making a moral accusation against the Bible, then I want to hear about these moral norms you've discovered and where you got them from. because I'd be encouraged to know how that can be known in your worldview. And as I said already, most non-Christians will absolutely have never heard that question before, because they never had to give an account for their own moral claims. People make grand sweeping truth claims all the time in the non-Christian world, and have never thought for a moment that I have to give an account for that. Christians, oh, you Christians have to give an account for that, but I don't have to give an account for that. No, you do. And so to make a moral claim against the Bible requires something more than it violating your own personal preference. Okay, this is a tour through 3 different parts of the content of the Bible challenges, and it's such a tiny little sampling. Some of you are going to want to do more here than, I hope, more than what we can cover in one session like this. So let me mention another resource for you I meant to mention last night, and that is the RTS mobile app. So at Reformed Theological Seminary, where I'm the president of the Charlotte campus, we have multiple campuses across the country, and we have a mobile app you can download on your Apple or Android phone. And when you do, that gives you access for free to almost all our courses. This is really stunning. You may not realize it, that RTS basically gives away almost all our courses for free to the whole world. You can go and listen to them online while mowing the lawn, riding in the car, doing whatever you do, on your earphones, in the airport. You can listen to all kinds of our classes. Classes about things like this. You can listen to my classes. There's all sorts of courses up there. Now, of course, you can't get a degree like that, right? But you can get the content like that. If you want to get a degree, there's other steps you're going to have to take. I hope if you want to get a degree at RTS, I'd love to talk with you more. But I'm just giving you the app as a way to get information and get training and get content. It's great material. On that app, we have other things too. We have chapel messages, special lectures, sermons, in addition to all our courses. It's a really helpful tool. It also tells you about events and activities and so forth. So just as a tuck away, another resource for you, one of the classes in there you need to get a hold of is James Anderson's apologetics class, which deals with a lot of this. James Anderson's a professor in Charlotte, phenomenally good. You take advantage of that as you think about looking for resources.